how we've gotten to this point in our Game of Thrones. On Mother's Day, we talked about Rahab. Rahab who led the spies into Jericho. And let us remember that Rahab is later related to Ruth and Boaz. So Boaz marries the Moabite, Ruth, and Ruth and Boaz have a son. Their son is Obed. Obed has a son. His son is Jesse, and Jesse has a son. His son is David. At the same time, we all of a sudden have Hannah, that we talked about on Mother's Day as well. And Hannah has prayed and prayed for a child, and she then has Samuel. Samuel grows up and appoints our first king, Saul. Saul has a son, Jonathan, who is his oldest son. So far you got it, Rahab, connected to Boaz, who's connected to Ruth, who then have Obed, Jesse, David. Then Hannah has Samuel, who appoints Saul to be king. As we know, Saul did not do a very good job. And so then Saul appoints David, who is the son of Jesse. So Saul is still alive, but now David has also been anointed as the person to be the future king. At the same time, as we heard in today's video, that means David and Jonathan know each other and they actually become best friends. Jonathan's father did not remember to follow God, and therefore, while he was still living and David was still anointed, they spent many years of jealousy together with Saul trying to hunt down David and to hurt him. As we continue, the text and the stories we will deal with get more complex and a little more brutal. It's important to make sure that we are aware of these stories that have gotten us to the point, because we may not be able to really understand the life-giving messages that are actually present, even amidst these really dark stories. Because while there is much darkness, in these stories our goal is to find where the light of God is moving, and to be able to learn from those experiences. My Hebrew scripture professor, Dr. Lisa Davison, actually was preaching last week on the books of Samuel, and she had this to share. The books of Samuel describe a time in Israel's history, or in Israel's story, when life was extremely precarious, when violence was the preferred way to settle disputes, when worship of nation was confused for worship of God, when people tried to explain natural events like a famine as a sign of God's unhappiness, when wars were waged in the name of God and human lives traded for protection and political power. On second thought, perhaps these biblical stories are not that different from our world today. Maybe that is why we don't want to read this text. It just hits a little too close to home. For in confronting this story, we might also have to confront our own injustice, desire for vengeance, and violence. While David lived in this world and even participated in it, as we saw from last week's story of Abigail, David continued to find ways and people who helped him overcome the desires for vengeance and violence against those who kept antagonizing him and trying to bring him to a low point. This was a tedious time for him as he was really having to go through struggles to prepare him for what it really meant to be king and a follower of God. And thus he found ways, and God helped him find ways to fight against the human responses. And often David was able to find a more holy response. Yet in today's story, the entire game that David has been playing begins to shift dramatically. In today's story, we see how David responds to the death of his dearest friend and his greatest nemesis. We witness from afar in the scripture today David's raw emotions that makes us feel almost awkward when we read it. It is an emotionally intense and intimate moment. And we ourselves have been so focused on the games of all of these different players and people that happen around these power structures that we sometimes forget ourselves that we are to understand these as real people and real relationships. They are not just characters in a story. That often we remain detached because engaging in these complicated relationships and structures means, kind of like Dr. Davidson said, opening ourselves up to a place where we must be vulnerable to our own imperfections and complicated relationships to others and the world, and ultimately the strength of our relationships to God. David also is mourning the change in his life, from the one anointed to the one who is now to be the king. The roles he has played up to this point are fugitive, friend, military leader. All of those kind of roles that he is known, being the second in line, is now all of a sudden over. Just as he had earlier moved from being a shepherd and the youngest son of Jesse into a new life in the shadow of Saul, he is now out of that shadow. And I am sure that in that moment of that news and information, the light and experience is overwhelming and blinding. That he is going through a major life change, and like all changes, we are witnessing how difficult that is going to be for him. I mean, Saul has chased him for years. I do not think, however, that David, as much as Saul kept going after him, David kept trying to find ways to reconcile this relationship with Saul, who seemed to hate him. And yet I think David sometimes really tried to be accepted by Saul. I think he was hoping that Saul would come around and finally regain the original sense of what God originally saw in Saul. I think David was always hoping Saul would figure out a way to be in better relationships with people and to follow God again, but Saul did not do that. Saul was never able to change his unhealthy patterns and continued to live in unhealthy ways that tormented David. And so the role that David knew for years as being the one chased is done, gone. And the hope of finding a positive resolution between these two men is also gone. Thus we see that David's grief is complicated. I've often found that those who mourn the loudest or the longest are the people who had the most intricate and complicated relationships with the person or the persons who died. The loss has left something incomplete or absent that was never resolved. That void that will always be slightly unhealthy and scarring. This includes tragic and sudden deaths that seem unresolvable in our emotions, like the death of a child. But then there are those other kinds of deaths, those like sisters who never quite got along after their fight 20 years ago, or the father whose child just kept making things difficult and having bad habits, or the grandmother who never really seemed to care quite like all the other grandmas, the lives and the relationships that somehow were never really able to find a sense of peace. Thus in death, they create more turbulent feelings and more unhealthy and desperate attempts to create false realities or ignore the truth of the situation. David's grief for Saul is complicated. David's grief over Jonathan is also a different type of grief. the Amalekite who brings the news to David, thinks that David will be glad that both his nemesis and the person who stood next in line to the throne are gone. And little does he know that Jonathan is actually a very different part of David's life. David's deepest love often is said for Jonathan. If you ever watched Grey's Anatomy, the best way I could describe this was that Jonathan was David's person. The easiest way to explain what it means to be someone's person is actually a quote from the show. It's also a little violent, but I figured since we were already going there in these scriptures, we might as well enjoy it. It says, "She is my person. If I murdered someone, she's the person I call to help me drag the corpse across the living room floor. She is my person." Jonathan had his own father throw a spear at him because he had chosen David as his person. Jonathan and David were there for each other in the difficult times of working with Saul. Jonathan helped David hide and stay safe. Jonathan was David's person. And now David has to figure out this new role, these sudden shifts and changes, without the one person he really trusts and knows to walk with him. So in the midst of these losses, the loss of youth, the loss of clarity, the loss of companionship, David is also responsible all of a sudden for the loss of those who fought and the loss of the Philistines alongside Saul, Jonathan, and others. You see, in the modern world, I think we often look towards our leaders to be stoic and seem fearless in the face of loss and grief. I wonder what would happen if our leaders were an example of grief and vulnerability in the most difficult losses, transitions, and changes. We seek from our leaders often words of comfort and strength. We seek from them to fix what is broken. But we do not seek from them to be broken. We do not want to witness their fears, their questions, their heartaches, because that means at that moment we must face our own. And yet David's willingness to mourn, to truly feel his grief, allowed him to let go of some of his pain and even some of his fear. C.S. Lewis said, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear." David's grief in this scripture lets him find a healthy way to begin to deal with the fear in the midst of this major change and loss. Now, before we finish, we have to acknowledge that when reading this story, I initially struggled with the sudden death of the man who brought the news. I mean, I grew up knowing that Shakespeare said, "Do not kill the messenger." So was this killing of the messenger just a knee-jerk response out of anger and frustration? Was it a tactical move in the face that now David is the anointed king and does not want someone to feel like they can kill him? Yet I started, as I did research, to think that David's grieving may have actually led him to move to a place of clarity. While killing anyone is a little too violent for my taste, the man who brought the information really wasn't just a messenger. He was like the family member who showed up at the funeral just in time to hear what he had gotten. Or maybe that same family member who showed up just in time at the hospital to make it feel a little awkward. The Amalekite's intentions do not really seem pure in the sharing of this news. In fact, they're not even the same story that we read in the chapter before this one at the end of 1 Samuel. There seems to be something not quite truthful or right in the man's eagerness to share this story. This man is playing the game of thrones at a time when the personal struggles are actually out doing the political moves. Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones is a quality player, and she has this to say: when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground. This man chose to play the Game of Thrones. Next week, we will continue this story because not everyone will automatically agree that David should be the new king. We will continue to see who lives, who dies, who gets in trouble, as the people of God try to live as a nation. And thus, as we continue in our lives, may we continue to find ways to live with the ability to grieve the losses that pain us, see the truth in the deceitful, and ultimately in all these complicated relationships, figure out how to live and see and know God in a complicated world. To be continued.